Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening for our fourth installment of Tell Me More, Conservation Minnesota Talks. We're excited that you're here with us, and we will be having a timely discussion about the importance of wetlands to Minnesota. I am Diane Meyer, and thankful to be a board member of Conservation Minnesota. As a pediatrician, I have helped treat many children with increasing frequency of asthma episodes, in part due to the poor air quality that we have noticed more often this past decade. Thus, I am thrilled to work with Conservation Minnesota to help protect the air and water quality for the younger generation and for all of Minnesotans. My favorite Minnesota region is the awesome wilderness of the Boundary Waters, which originally brought me to Minnesota from Wisconsin back in high school. For those of you who may not be familiar with Conservation Minnesota, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect the Minnesota we love. We do this through solving some of our state's most important environmental problems. We are committed to protecting people and places from the adverse impacts of pollution as well as climate change, while ensuring that everyone who calls Minnesota home has access to the great outdoors, plus opportunities to enjoy it. Our work is centered around bringing people together across regions, backgrounds, and beliefs to find real solutions together. Tonight, we will be talking about wetlands and their impact on clean water. Minnesota has lost over 50% of our wetland habitat and close to 95% in southern and western counties. We've assembled a panel of experts who will tell us more about the importance of wetlands, the threats they face, the restoration progress currently occurring, and what we need for a clean water future. We have with us some amazing ecologists, scientists, and program managers who are working right here in Minnesota. Before we move into our panel discussion, I'd first like to take a moment to introduce our moderator for the evening, Brianna Bemboon, Public Engagement Director at Conservation Minnesota. Brianna's works to ensure that our public engagement programs are both impactful and far-reaching. Brianna's favorite outdoor space in Minnesota is Ruth Lake in Crow Wing County, a sentimental space that she returns to yearly. Brianna, tell us more about who you have with us tonight for the panel discussion.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Diane, and a shout out to my colleague Avery, who is doing a lot of the behind the scenes work to make this event happen tonight. It's great to see all of you here and learn about clean water. This is an issue that Minnesotans care deeply about. I'm sure you're familiar, Diane, but our audience might not be. In a recent survey that Conservation Minnesota conducted, 92% of Minnesotans said clean water is extremely important to them. And it wasn't really until recently that I fully understood the role that wetlands played in clean water. So I'm really excited to learn more and be able to share this information tonight. To help us with that, we have three guests who I'm going to introduce, but they're all local wetland experts. Our first guest is Chris Lenhart, a restoration ecologist from the Nature Conservancy. He helps plan, monitor, and research wetland and stream restoration projects. When not at the Nature Conservancy, he's also a research professor at the University of Minnesota. You may know him from NPR, where he did a climate cast on his peatland restoration work. We have a tradition here at Conservation Minnesota where we ask all of our guests the same question. And so I'm going to ask you it. Chris, what is your favorite place in Minnesota?
Oh, well, besides my backyard, I mean, I would say probably somewhere up in northern Minnesota, in the Gunflint Trail. There's some lakes we go to up there. Definitely in terms of outdoors, that'd probably be my favorite.
For sure. It's a gorgeous area. I can't go wrong. Thanks for being here. Next on our list, we have John, the partner from the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program Manager with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. He has worked with the Partners Program for the last 15 years and not only has experience restoring wetlands in Minnesota, but he's also done restoration work in 6 different states throughout the country. His work focuses on successfully restoring degraded habitats to former condition, and he typically restores an impressive 40 to 100 wetlands per year across Minnesota. Thanks for being here, John. What is your favorite place in Minnesota?
That's a tough one. Probably Bearhead Lake State Park, everything that it has to offer.
I don't think I've been to that one. I'll have to add it to my list. And then last but not least, our final guest is Dan Schaff, our senior ecologist and vegetation specialist with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. His work focuses on building conservation partnerships, doing community restoration, pollinator protection, and climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. So a little bit of everything. He's taught design and ecological restoration classes at the University of Minnesota for the last 25 years. And he's also authored several publications on habitat restoration, water, wetlands, all of it. So Dan, what is your favorite place in Minnesota?
Well, there's a lot of beautiful places. I guess I would say the Boundary Waters. I think paddling the lakes up there really inspired my conservation work.
For sure. Well, thanks for being here tonight too. So, before I jump in with all our questions, I'd just like the audience to know that there will be time for audience questions at the end. If you have any questions throughout this presentation that you'd like to ask our panelists, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen that you can type your question in. We'll kind of put it aside, record it, and then we'll come back to it at the end. So at any time you can throw that in there. So we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty eventually, but before we get there, I want to start with the basics because I don't want to assume knowledge. When I think of a wetland, I think of this that was behind my house growing up, but I know swamps aren't the only kind of wetland. So, Chris, can you tee us off on what a wetland is exactly?
Yeah, good question. We were just talking about this in class the other day, but yeah, so I mean, wetlands in general are areas that are transition between the uplands and the really wet areas. It's kind of simple definition. So they're areas that are, they hold some water at least some of the time. They're not under 20 feet of water like a lake, but they can be ones that aren't wet that much. So we have things like wet prairies that are only kind of wet for a few weeks and would look like a prairie most of the time. And then you got, ones that are classic marsh with the cattails that most people would recognize as a wetland, but you also have things like floodplain forests, which, might be under 10 feet of water after a flood, but you go out there in October, it looks just like a forest, into bogs in the north, which, um, yeah, some people would recognize as wetlands. Others would just think it's some kind of a northern forest looking thing if you're driving by it. And, those are the ones that are spongy and have all the peat and moss and things. So, yeah, there's a wide variety of types, but, they all got the common theme of the water and having wet soils and, plants that can grow in those wet conditions.
Cool. I think many Minnesotans believe that we have incredibly clean water for drinking and recreation, but like you were hearing before, that's not always the case. According to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, 25% of our lakes are not clean enough to be safe for recreation, like swimming. So Dan, I'm throwing this question to you. How do wetlands help keep our water clean?
Well, there's multiple levels of cleaning that happen with wetlands. They're part of natural systems that slow water down and allow it to settle. So a lot of the sediment and other nutrients settle out within wetlands. The plants play an important role. They're helping to filter the pollutants as they're moving through these systems as well. The plants take up some of the nutrients. And then these systems are biologically rich. They have a lot of microbes in them, and those microbes actually help break down contaminants. They do something called denitrification in wetlands, where they essentially transform nitrogen. And so they're helping to take nitrogen out of our water bodies.
Cool. That's helpful. I feel like hearing kind of like the technical breakdown even helps me, even though I've been doing this work for a little bit now. Although we're here to talk obviously about the role that wetlands play in clean water, I do want to touch, before we go a little too deep into that, I do want to touch briefly on kind of all the other benefits of wetlands too. John, do you want to talk a little bit about what wetlands do for like our ecosystem outside of just cleaning our water?
Sure. Wetlands obviously have a very important role on the landscape from the wildlife standpoint of it. One of the key interests from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's perspective, migratory bird habitat. That's where a lot of people stereotypically think of a wetland, of a mallard or a wood duck, utilizing that space, which they do. But there's many other species that rely on wetlands at some critical part of their life cycle. Secretive marsh birds, how important that are to their migratory corridors. So we're talking herons and egrets and things of that nature. Blandings turtles, maybe you perhaps heard of those, being from Minnesota, an important species that's of concern in the state. Wetlands are a critical component. Other mammals and amphibians need them for parts of their life cycle. But there's other things too that people don't think about, the ancillary benefits to what they provide. A lot of people don't think about how a wetland plays a critical role for successful mussel habitat in a stream. It's cleaning up of particulates that the wetland catches before it continues down a drainage network into a stream, helps mussels. Same could be said in certain high water areas and some of our more trout waters. High elevation wetlands, perhaps their beaver wetlands, will allow for a more timely release of water cooler later in the water that helps conditions of a cold water stream. So they do a lot of different things depending on where they're at in the landscape, and provide a lot of habitat in that way. Another thing is obviously, Dan kind of touched on it, flood control, water storage. All these things really help play into helping the landscape be a healthy, sustainable system. So it doesn't matter if it's a quarter acre in size or 50 acres in size. It matters where it's at in the watershed and how it contributes to or interacts with the other things around it.
Yeah, I know personally for me, like when I think of a wetland, I don't think of it without also thinking about birds for some reason. Like in my head, they're so interconnected that one doesn't happen without the other. So, um, since you were actually just talking, I'm going to throw another question right back at you. Um, so, in the last 100 years, um, we've lost over, well, actually, no, I'm going to back up. Sorry about that. There's so much to talk about. I just want to dive too deep in too quickly. But being the land of 10,000 lakes, we know that we have a lot of water here in Minnesota. And since maybe you were just talking, can you touch a little bit on like how common wetlands are in Minnesota? Are they as common as lakes? Are they more common? What does that look like?
But presume you're talking to me for that question? Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Well, they used to be very, very common. When we talk about wetland loss in the state, it's hard to conceive actually how many we did have versus what we went to. The wetlands far outnumbered the lakes that we have in the state, would be one thing that I regard. People don't think about how beaver ponds, when settlement first happened to this state, before it was a state, there was millions and millions of beavers and all the ponds and wetlands that existed in the headwater regions that were there. no longer there. As well as all the other things that have been manipulated by man in some way. So in short, the answer, there used to be many more than we have of lakes historically, and maybe Dan could back me up on that. So
Yeah, I would agree. They're very extensive in our landscapes. So the estimate is that we've lost about 50%, and we currently have about 10.6 million acres. That's about 20% of our land area. So, you know, we still have a lot of wetlands. It's a lot of different types. That includes marshes, swamps, meadows, forested wetlands, ephemeral wetlands that don't hold water as long in the spring. So it's a real diversity of wetland types that we have across the state. But it is significant that we've lost about 50% of them. The hydrology has changed in a lot of the ones that we have remaining. So we might have big peatland systems up in the north, but their hydrology may be different. So they may not be functioning as intact wetlands like they used to. So that's another thing that is happening with wetlands across the state, that they may be drier, they may be wetter too, in some cases because of drainage water or other things coming into some of those wetlands.
Well, it sounds like we've lost a lot of wetlands over the years. What do we do about that? Is there any hope of getting back to kind of where it was before?
yeah, I can cover that. Obviously, Minnesota is a great state to live in. I've worked in several other states over the course of my career for the federal government, and they all kind of carry their own protections and laws. There's some national laws that protect wetlands, but Minnesota's no net loss policies is really critical. It's really hard to replicate a high functioning wetland. So protecting what we have left is really important. And the state also does a wonderful job providing protections and easement opportunities for landowners if it's in private ownership or elsewhere to try to continue to protect them. I think on the other side of that, we also need to restore and enhance everything we can. A lot of people probably do not recognize, Dan alluded to the amount of manipulations that have happened to these systems on the landscape. And every one matters. Every one you can bring back matters. And so doing as many of those as we can. And really it's about affecting the hydrology, just as Dan was alluding to. It's too wet or it's too dry, which affects the vegetation negatively and all these other factors. And so when we can restore and bring that back, it's helping protect the other wetlands in the system or other habitat pieces. So
so it sounds like there's definitely some possibilities there for restoring them. What's the biggest challenge in wetland restoration? And maybe Chris, I'll throw this one to you since you've been quiet for a little bit here.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, you know, I think always it's been just finding willing landowners, you know, and having enough money to do it. It's there's just been so many drained, and it's fairly expensive. You know, difficult to convince people to do it. Although, yeah, with John's program, who we work with on that, they've been able to find a lot of landowners in that, you know, central part of the state, especially. But definitely just finding the land in the first place and having the money to do it. And, you know, I mean, I think more and more the climate change is affecting things as well. That especially with the peatlands up north. So, you know, we've been working on restoring, protecting peatlands. Minnesota, especially the northern part, and with the warmer temperatures, it's harder to keep the peatlands as like a sink for all the carbon, and that has been switching them toward more of a source where they're emitting carbon dioxide into the air, and so I think the climate change is making, you know, adding another challenge on top of what have been, you know, the kind of traditional challenges of just finding places to do it and having enough money to do as much as would make a big difference.
Yeah. You brought up a few things there that I actually want to touch on. The first thing you talked about is kind of one challenge is just finding the funding for it. And so I'm going to throw this question out for all of you, but is there funding for restoration work currently? Like, where does that come from, and how, like, is that being utilized?
Oh, yeah, I mean, well, I can say my part, and these other two probably have maybe more to say on that, but yeah, I mean, there is funding. I mean, we've gotten money from TNC, from private foundations and things like that, but from the EPA, has had some funding for climate change and wetlands. And there's the clean water funding programs at the state of Minnesota with the Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council, and the LCCMR is a grant that's more for research related to wetlands. But then, yeah, I mean, in these, John and Dan can maybe talk about maybe their own programs that fund wetland work.
Dan, I'm gonna let you go next because you got a lot of good programs.
Okay, yeah, we have multiple programs that we're working on related to wetlands. The Reinvest in Minnesota program is one of them, which is our largest program that's restoring wetlands. And then we have a wetland banking program. There's also Clean Water Fund, which is using those funds from the dedicated tax to restore wetlands. Estimate is we restored about 6,500 wetlands as an agency, around 100,000 acres. But it's important to note that that all happens in partnerships. So that's working with federal agencies, with these projects, local governments, Nature Conservancy, different organizations. We're working, in partnership on these programs. So in some cases we have state money and then we match it with federal money. So it's important that we have these multiple sources that we're bringing in to use for this wetland restoration. And we are fortunate in Minnesota. We do have tax dollars that are going towards wetland restoration. That's not true in most other states. So, we have strong wetland protections, but we also have some funding sources that we can use for wetland restoration.
The only thing I'd have to add, yeah, different federal programs also provide funding through a different means. I guess to sum up what we're trying to say, there's a lot of different pots in a lot of different places, and they can be specific to locality. They could be that you have to perpetually protect your property, and sometimes no, you don't have to perpetually protect your property. And my best advice for anybody interested in that is to reach out to an expert and let them guide that path for you as to what may be available for that particular location.
I love that, breaking it down into real things that someone can navigate. So, and then the other thing that I wanted to touch on that Chris was talking about is you alluded to this kind of like partnership that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has that works with landowners. John, can you tell us a little bit more about that? I honestly don't know a whole lot about that program.
Most don't. We don't advertise, so it's okay. The Partners for Fish and Wildlife program is actually a nationwide program. It's held under the National Wildlife Refuge System. And it was enacted back in the 80s, around the same time as the Farm Bill, when it was recognized that Congress recognized that if we were going to have positive impacts on the wildlife species and habitat that the public cares about, we were going to have to step outside of the refuge boundaries to accomplish those goals. And so the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program was born. We should have a great amount of pride. It actually was founded in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, right here. It's we take a lot of pride in that in this state that this program began there. And this program's really kind of unique. Government can be kind of rigid, or at least have that fear of it. The Partners program has maintained a relatively high level of flexibility by that standard. It's a very flexible program to fit the needs of specific habitat sites on private lands. It's not a perpetual easement, although we help landowners get into them when it's the right fit for them. But we also have this good faith agreement that we can do where we can help a landowner restore habitat on their property using federal dollars, among all these others, as well as getting the technical design assistance with a simple good faith. You'll maintain it as a wetland for 10 years. And we do that all across the landscape. The Partners Program has representation in every county in the state, and I think annually we average about 5,000 acres of habitat, which shows, because we do more than just wetlands, but usually it's just over 1,000 acres a year in wetland restoration. So we carry a pretty good impact, and we have a great group of biologists that has a lot of expertise for that. And then the partnership piece of with TNC is the critical piece of this, because we're constantly trying to learn how to do this better. The fact of the matter is, we've only been trying to restore habitat for this little tiny period of time that humans have, and we're still learning. And we've been studying the human body almost 10 times longer than we've been trying to figure out how to bring back what we've lost or what we've altered. And well, Mother Nature's 1,000 times more complex. And so the research, the assistance to do more and do better restorations that we have with the Nature Conservancy has been integral. We've been able to do so many more wetlands. Not only that, but learn about what we're doing, and specifically as to what you guys are talking about in water quality, how these specific headwater wetlands are helping nitrogen, phosphorus reduction, carbon sequestration, storage, mitigation from floodwater, things of that nature. And I'll let Chris finish with the rest of that part, but absolutely wonderful information we're learning about those aspects of our efforts.
Cool. So that's like, sounds like a few different steps that people have taken to kind of like, you know, work to restore these habitats. Dan, maybe to you, the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources has done a tremendous amount of work restoring wetlands, and we could probably spend a whole hour or more discussing those restoration efforts alone. Do you have a favorite kind of project that you can share with us, or something that you're doing that you're really excited about?
Yeah, we've been, restoring wetlands across the state. So, it's exciting work to be involved in, because, all the wetlands are different. Every site we go to is a little bit different. There's been some really large restorations happening through the RIM program. There's an Armstrong project that is a state federal partnership. That site has restored about 800 acres in Steele County. So it's more in southern Minnesota. It does have a peat soil, and we're pretty focused on sites with peat soils right now because they hold a lot of carbon. And as Chris was mentioning, if they're drained, they're losing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So peatlands have become a big emphasis of the work that we're doing. We have funding right now to restore peatland systems. So that's an exciting area of work. It is an area where there's a lot to learn yet. We're still, trying to figure out, how do we restore the hydrology? How do we get the vegetation back after these sites have been drained for long periods of time? They start to decompose as they're exposed to oxygen. There's microbes that are breaking down that organic material, and that's what's releasing the carbon dioxide. And we do have large peatlands in northern Minnesota, so we're looking for opportunities to restore those. There was a really big wetland bank up there, the Lake Superior Wetland Bank. It's now part of the Sax-Zim Bog. So those are really important efforts. That was about a 24,000 acre restoration project. So it's great to see those kinds of projects happen and bringing the hydrology back to those really big wetland systems. But we really need wetland restorations of all sizes, and we need them all across the state. So we need this network because they're so important within these landscapes, providing these multiple benefits. We need them in locations in all parts of Minnesota.
Definitely. Chris, I feel like John kind of teed you up and already talked a lot about what TNC is working on, but is there any other restoration efforts that you'd like to talk about?
Oh yeah, no, I could talk about a few, but yeah, so our chapter works in the Dakotas as well as Minnesota, so it's Minnesota and both Dakota states. I just mentioned a couple. I mean, the peatlands has been one of the more interesting ones. So starting about 4-ish years ago, TNC started looking at peatlands as a strategy for mitigating climate change, not aside from all the other benefits. And so we've been working on research and then developing a strategy. We recently put out this document called a peatland playbook for Minnesota. So the peat team, we have a peat team at TNC, Kristen Bland and others. So yeah, so that's been fun and interesting, and it's fun working in the northern bogs. They're kind of a nice environment. Except for in the winter when it's -20, but they're a fun place to work. So the peatlands have been a really cool project this last few years. TNC's been working on wetlands really for a long time, going back, decades. There's been a lot in western Minnesota. There's like a program to help with easements on wetlands and farmed areas in the Prairie Pothole region. That was a big effort TNC's been involved with for years. And I'll mention one other one, which is interesting out in the Dakotas. Lori Brown and some others out there have been working on these beaver dam restorations. We're restoring pretty small little basins, but out in the Dakotas, this is the Western Dakotas, fewer wetlands way out there. And so kind of, valuable and kind of like a newer, they've been doing it for a while now. These either replacing the beaver dams themselves or a beaver dam analog, which is kind of like a fake beaver dam made like out of logs. But yeah, so those are some of the ones. Kind of could go on for a while, but all the work with John, of course. So we work together on the partnership has been referring to, and it's been fun working on those as well. A lot of small to mid-sized ones, kind of in the middle of the state.
Yeah. It sounds like kind of coming into this, I was like, man, there's still so much work to be done, but it's really cool to hear you guys all lay out the work that's already been done and is happening. And it gives me a little bit of, hope to hear it all laid out in one long kind of list there. So
Yeah.
we are going to do maybe 2 more questions from me before we get into the questions from the audience. We have quite a few lining up there. So my question for anyone who wants to jump in now is like personally, I care a lot about clean water and wetlands, but I don't always know what I can do about it. What can individuals like me or people in the audience do to help protect wetlands or water quality?
I'll start with that one. It was kind of prefaced on that question, and I alluded to, I'll give it a couple parts here, but it's okay not to know what you don't know. Reach out to experts. Ask them, is this a healthy functioning wetland? If you wanted to know why or why not. There's so many different types. Wetlands is really a big topic. If you can't pick up on that, they come in many shapes, sizes, and forms. And so don't be afraid to reach out to the experts to learn. It's an amazing system. They're amazing systems, and they're all unique. And if you know people that have intact wetlands, healthy wetland, maybe they're private landowners or something to that nature, try to get them. Have you ever considered an easement to protect that investment for the state? Or perhaps maybe they're not interested in that, or there's something impacted, an area that is ditched and drained, or an area completely covered by cattails when it wasn't hybrid, non-native invasive cattails or something of that nature. Again, reach out to an expert to see if somebody can help improve that condition. And the last thing that I would state is public sentiment matters. Your voice matters. And if you care about wetlands, say you care about wetlands to people, because your congressmen and women of the world listen. It may not seem like they do, but they do. And the future funding for these things will matter because of that. So public sentiment is important. So I'll stop there for my answer on that.
I could add on just like what you can do personally for water quality. I mean, if you own property, you can do like rain gardens or like adopt a drain. I mean, the rain garden is, a small depression that holds water for a little bit of time and native plants. And it's kind of a fun way to learn about some of the wetland plants and do something locally, or like the adopt a drain where you try to keep, leaves and other stuff that would get into the water and carry nutrients. You can do that. So there's a number of things you can do right on your own property. Dan's worked on a lot of this kind of stuff too.
yeah, we really try to encourage residents of Minnesota to do native plantings, to install rain gardens, do things where you can capture water, because if we can capture water close to where it falls, it's not moving and carrying pollutants into water bodies. So it is really significant what individuals can do related to the environment. And I guess I would add invasive species control there too, trying to control invasive species on property, preventing them from moving to other areas. There's also some volunteer opportunities with nonprofits to be involved in managing landscapes. So I think that's, you know, another way for involvement. And I would agree with being an advocate for wetlands, finding ways to raise awareness of wetlands, get legislators involved, newspaper articles, supporting environmental nonprofits that are working on these topics as well.
As a fellow nonprofit worker, I love the plug for the volunteer opportunities in the nonprofit world. Chris, did you have something to expand on that?
Oh no, sorry, I was just getting just
You're
unmuting.
just getting ready, yeah. And so I actually had another question that I want to ask you, but we're getting so many good questions in the chat. And actually one kind of reminded me of, John, what you were just talking about. So I'm just going to jump straight to the audience questions. So one person asked, how well does the general public understand the importance of wetlands? Like, rather than thinking of them as just swampy or unusable land, and kind of like what efforts or communications have you seen that work well in changing people's perceptions? Anyone can take that.
Wait, well, I mean, I'll just say quick that I did feel like it has improved a lot even since I was a kid. And Minnesota is probably better than a lot of states. I grew up in Northwest Ohio, where wetlands were, you know, like the enemy. It was the Great Black Swamp that they had drained, and literally people were like annoyed or not wanting, you know, if you talk about wetlands, they thought it was a bad thing, you know. I mean, and that that was a while ago. But yeah, I mean, I do feel like it's improved a lot, and yeah, I think mostly they might not understand the specifics of the hydrology or the science, but I think a lot of people do have a picture of a wetland. Some of those more obscure types, they might not, you know about that, but yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I would agree. There's a strong environmental ethic in Minnesota. You know, I do a lot of work around pollinator protection, and it's just been amazing that, you know, the interest in some of these topics with the public. I think part of that is because of a lot of newspaper articles, a lot of outreach that's happened for pollinators, and that's starting to happen more with wetlands. So I think we're seeing more articles about the importance of different types of wetlands. There's been some recent articles on peatlands. I think that's really important for raising awareness about the need for restoration and protection of wetlands, and that's just something we need more of.
I don't have too much to add. I try not to put people in boxes. People's expertise I found to be quite diverse individually, depending on circumstances, but we can always learn more, and we always can do a better job outreaching to helping people understand the importance of a wetland in a landscape, specifically in a state like Minnesota, where we're at the tippy top of of two major watersheds with the Red River and the Mississippi headwaters. And so they are really integral up here for a lot of reasons, from wildlife to many other geologic reasons.
I was kind of thinking about this question the other day, and I'm not an expert like you guys, but I've been thinking about how a lot of times we don't know what we have until it's gone, and then you start to see the effects of that. And just thinking about how you guys were all talking about how many wetlands we've lost over time. I wonder if we're just starting to see the kind of outcomes of that, and that way it's coming to people's attention because we're kind of noticing what it looks like without those wetlands that we've relied on. Did you want to expand on that, John? Sorry.
No, we are seeing the things. The rapid rate of erosion, how fast water gets to a location. Some of that's other human manipulations that happen. Gulf hypoxia, we're a partial contributor to those issues down in the Gulf. Some of these water quality issues that we're doing. The lack of loss of groundwater table and the importance of wetlands is recharging groundwater when they're ditched. So we are seeing impacts, and there is a curve of benefit. And so I don't want to depress anybody, but wetland restorations is all pretty much all I do, and it's critically important. But I know that when I restore and bring back the hydrology of the wetland that I restore, it's not behaving as well as an intact wetland. In fact, from a microbial activity, and Dan, maybe you can give a more accurate answer than I can, or Chris, it takes at least a decade for that restored wetland to truly even act like a wetland again in all its aspects. Yes, it will fill up with water. Yes, we will have wetland vegetation around there, and wildlife will use it, and it will start providing many benefits right away. However, to get it to quote unquote running on all cylinders, it takes time to allow it to heal. That's where Dan was talking about the peatlands and trying to understand how do you reverse a peatland trend from a loss to coming back. And so the answer is complex, but we're certainly seeing the signs of their absence now. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing what we can to get as many back as we can.
I'm looking at some of our audience questions, and it feels like there are some that are along the same lines. So I'm going to try to condense all of them. But I think there are people who are looking for some of the nitty-gritty of like what happens when you restore a wetland. Someone asked, like, is it digging? Is it draining? Is it planting? Another person asked, like, how long does it typically take to restore a wetland that has been degraded or even destroyed? So like if you like start to try to restore a wetland, what does that look like from the most basic kind of perspective?
I'm gonna let Dan start. They're all different. So.
Well, it starts with a lot of assessment. So we're really looking at the landscape and looking at the watershed, making sure that we can bring the water back. As a general approach, we try to restore the hydrology that would have been there historically, because that's going to bring back the biology the best that was there a couple hundred years ago. So we're really assessing the landscape. We have complex land ownership now as well, so we don't want to flood neighbors. There's a lot of considerations when we do a wetland restoration, and just a lot of planning and looking at contours and just the lay of the land that we need to think about when we're doing it. And how are we going to restore the hydrology? We have ditches that are draining wetlands. We also have drain tile under a lot of sites where drain tile was put in for agriculture to keep a wetland dry. So there's a lot of complexity there around exactly what needs to be done to bring that water back. And sometimes it is just blocking ditches. That's more common up north with the peatlands, that we might be blocking ditches up there. As we get into ag landscapes, there's a lot more tile that we're blocking and disabling. So it really depends on where we are. And so that involves bulldozers and heavy equipment to come in and do a lot of that work with filling the ditches and breaking the tile. So a fair amount of earthwork that's happening, and outlets are put in quite often to hold the water back. And then there's seeding, that's part of it as well. Seeding the wetland areas, seeding the upland areas. I think with a lot of the wetlands we do, the uplands play a really important role because they're the buffers that are protecting the wetlands. So we pay a lot of attention to restoring those upland prairies and forest areas, other ecosystems around the wetlands. So there's all that vegetation part to it, but it's amazing. Sometimes we'll do construction in late fall. The next spring, those wetlands will fill up with water and it looks like a wetland again. So it's pretty amazing how fast that transition can happen. Bringing back the full biology may take decades, but getting the water back sometimes happens pretty fast.
Yeah, all the above to what you said, Brianna, removing sediment, eliminating invasive species, restoring the hydrology through a man-made earthen structure that would plug that. And sometimes we want critters to do that for us, i.e. beavers. I've done beaver analog systems to try to bring beaver ponds back, wetlands back, excuse me. And how I'm not bragging, but I've done probably somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 wetland restorations in my career, and I've never done two the exact same way because of what Dan's talking about. Proper evaluation and trying to understand what that site looked like prior to human manipulation is what kind of separates the science and the art of what we're doing, but it's the most critical part of it, and just trying to do things that we're capable of manipulating and doing to get it as much back to that condition as possible.
There's a question kind of related, I feel like. Someone asked if there is a type of wetland that's more difficult to restore than others, or are there ones that like are at more need, or like just comparing the different kinds of wetlands. How do you go about that? Are they different?
Oh, well, I would say that the fens are one of the harder ones to restore because they rely on these groundwater inputs that are often across like the whole landscape. So it involves like protecting areas or restoring flow paths across a whole watershed. So they're definitely a little more challenging to restore. I think the peatlands can be again, you can get them wet like Dan said, but you're not necessarily, you can't rebuild the peat. Peat takes thousands of years to accumulate, and so that doesn't happen overnight. Some of them you can, like a cattail marsh, you can, uh reflood an area and have cattails in like a year. So there's a huge range in the difficulties. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with what Chris says, and then there we have to consider the human dimensions part of that answer. Seasonal wetlands are some of the most overlooked wetlands on our landscape because they're easy to drain and produce on, or maybe you don't recognize them as a wetland as an individual, but they're among the most critical for wildlife species and many other reasons. So that would be from a human side perspective, but from a scientific technical side, I would definitely side with Chris with fence. Very hard. So
Chris, you brought up peat, and we actually have a question specific to that I think is really interesting. Someone asked how peat is extracted and if they should buy peat for their garden, or if that's kind of wreaking havoc on our wetlands.
Oof, yeah, okay, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so most of the extraction is just for the horticultural peat moss, like you buy in a bag at the hardware store. And so they are usually doing it in kind of layers. It's not like they're taking out 6 feet hunks of the peat. Um, like if they do it for energy. So like, like in Northern Europe and like in Ireland, when they used to like burn it for, fuel, they would cut out these big hunks and like burn it like that. But the peat moss extraction's a little less impactful. It's certainly not great. You're still draining it out temporarily. But if they can reflood it and reestablish the plants when they're done extracting, there is ability to restore it. So, I think in Canada they have a lot better rules about that, about restoring bogs where they've extracted peat moss. So, I would maybe feel better about buying it from those companies because it's probably a little more sustainably produced. The US, I think they're just not as many rules about it, about how we restore those peat bogs where they've extracted peat moss. But, we never did do the energy thing. In Minnesota in the, way back in the 80s and 90s, they're looking at extracting peat for energy where they would have just been excavating it like whole hog and then like burning it. That never happened, unfortunately. And the peat moss impact is way smaller. The footprint is very small in Minnesota compared to the area impacted by drainage ditches, for example. Yes. I don't know. Any more on that, anybody?
A complicated issue for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Um, I am trying to again combine a few different questions that we've gotten now, but we've gotten a few questions on like the geographical differences of wetlands. So, one person is curious about how climate change and the changing weather is affecting kind of like our wetlands and what plants grow in specific areas, and if there might have been, for example, like a certain kind of wetland in a certain place 50 years ago and now it might not do as well as the same area. Is that a concern at all that you guys are looking forward at?
I can start with that. Prairie potholes is one type of wetland that goes through the Dakotas and through a good part of Minnesota as well in the prairie pothole region where the prairies were. And climate change is projected to get drier in the Dakotas, potentially wetter in parts of Minnesota just because of extreme rainfall increasing, that we get more heavy rainfall coming down at times. So that's a concern for duck production. A lot of that happened or has happened historically in the Dakotas. So if they're getting drier and there's an expansion of agriculture in the Dakotas, there's potentially going to be a lot less waterfowl production out there. So Minnesota's wetlands become maybe even more important for waterfowl production. But northern wetlands, we have concerns there as well as temperatures increase, that peatlands may be drying out in areas. Just the increased temperatures that we're experiencing can lead to more emissions from these wetlands as well. So there's potentially multiple impacts from climate change with wetlands in different places. And John works a lot in prairie potholes. You may have more perspective on the waterfowl production as well.
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Obviously critical duck nesting pairs from a wildlife standpoint from that. But don't sell as we move east and into the other parts of the region of the state for other waterfowl production needs. Again, I think I alluded to some of the secretive marsh bird habitat, like how many successful nestings we have with a lot of those species in Minnesota is second to none. Where we have good intact habitat.
Great. So we probably only have time for one more question, even though we have a ton of questions still in the chat. So I'm sorry if we're not able to get to your question tonight, but I want to end kind of like on a high note a little bit. And so I'm going to end with this question. What gives you hope for wetlands and water quality in the future?
I can start. One thing we noticed is that the public is really engaged related to biodiversity loss of pollinators, loss of birds. So the public is getting very engaged in these topics. And I think that's really important, and it's really good to see. And really we need support across our landscapes for supporting a wide range of plant and animal species. And I think that is happening. We already have a strong environmental ethic in Minnesota, but I think it's getting even stronger due to these challenges that we're facing.
Well, yeah, I don't know. For me, I think just working on restoration projects is a very, hopeful thing. And it's one of the reasons why I've wanted to be involved in that in my life, is being able to turn something back that's been degraded into some functioning environment. So just being involved in those projects is motivating for me and a lot of people. I think, we get, if you get volunteers and others out and working or doing, some part of those projects, whether it's, planting or pulling weeds or, I think that is a good way to get people to learn about it and motivated about it. Yeah, definitely.
For me, first and foremost, people care. That matters. What gives me a lot of hope is when we're working on a project, let's just say in rural Benton County, and we do a restoration on a private landowner's property, i.e. Working with TNC, Dr. Lenhart, and myself. And we do this wetland, and the next year it comes back and it looks like a wetland again, and they're stuck sitting in it. And all of a sudden, even though we're not advertising, I get 6 phone calls by the neighboring landowners, and they're like, well, I want that. Sure, cool. That's where a lot of this stuff is coming in support. So I think people realize, you know, that going back to what Dan said about the conservation ethic, it's like when they see what it was and what it can be, people care and they want things to be better. There's a lot of pride in ownership, land ownership, and things like that. So I think we can continue to make a great impact in the state of Minnesota.
Perfect. I love ending on that high note. One question that we do have in the chat is a few people asked about who they can reach out to for help with their wetlands on their property and stuff. We'll follow up with some resources for you all when we send out a follow-up email, because we're not going to have time to address that all right now. But thank you everyone for coming, and I will turn it over to Diane for just some final little wrap-up announcements. You're muted, Diane. Sorry.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And a big thank you to Chris Lenhart, John Riens, and Dan Shaw for sharing your expertise with us. I know I learned a lot. Thank you to Brianna for leading an engaging discussion. As we all agree, every Minnesotan deserves clean drinking water. And Conservation Minnesota will continue to advocate and protect the restoration of wetlands by supporting a statewide restoration goal to help guide this work. If you'd like to stay in touch, sign up for our email, look at future events, go to conservationminnesota.org. And if you'd like to watch previous Tell Me More episodes, visit Conservation Minnesota YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us this evening. And enjoy Minnesota.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.